The lamps had been lit an hour before. A slow rain drifted across the Norfolk fields, and inside Stanfield Hall the fire had settled into its evening burn. Isaac Jermy stepped from the dining room into the porch as he did each night, to take the air before the house was closed. He did not see the figure at the corner of the porch. He did not see the long cloak, or the wig, or the crepe drawn over the face. He heard the click of a pistol, and then a sound the old house had never carried before. Somewhere in the passage above, his son turned toward the noise. A second shot broke the quiet of the hall, and in the servant's stare, a young woman began, very slowly, to understand what was moving through the rooms below. The quiet before the fall. Good evening and welcome. My name matters very little tonight. What matters is that you have found your way here, that the lamp beside your bed has been dimmed, that whatever noise the day carried has begun to fall away from your shoulders. This is the Bedside Historian. Wherever you are listening from, a house on a hill, a flat above a busy road, a caravan at the edge of the sea, a bed you have known for years or one you have only just crept into for the first time, I am glad of your company. Tell me, in whatever quiet way you like, what time it is on your side of the night, and let that be the clock we keep between us for the next hour. Before your eyes grow heavy, if you can, please subscribe to the channel and press the little heart or the thumb below this story. It costs you nothing, and it helps this candle stay lit for the next listener who cannot sleep. And now let us drift back. We are going to the east of England, to a low, wet county called Norfolk, on an ordinary evening in the autumn of 1848. The year had almost run its course. Fields that had carried barley and wheat in the summer had been turned back to bare earth. Rooks moved between the copses in slow, ragged lines. The days had grown short, and the roads out of Wymondham were already thick with the mud that the drovers cursed each winter. If you had stood at a crossroads on the Norwich road at this hour, you would have heard very little: a cartwheel somewhere behind a hedge, a cottage door pulled shut against the damp, and, if the wind was right, the tolling of a distant church bell over the flats. At the end of a long lane, behind a screen of old oaks and a moat that had held water since the Wars of the Roses, stood the house we are going to sit outside for a little while. It was called Stanfield Hall. It was not the largest house in Norfolk, and it was not the finest, but it was one of the oldest. The record does not agree on every detail of its building. Parts of it were medieval, and parts of it had been rebuilt after a fire in the years before the French Revolution. The result was a low, rambling manor of red brick and stone, with tall chimneys and small mullioned windows, and a porch at the front that carried a lamp on winter evenings. We have to go inside for a moment, but I want you to keep the picture of the outside in your mind: the moat, the lamps at the porch, the rooks settling in the oaks, because it is the last picture of this house as an ordinary house. Every generation of listeners to this story has stood, in imagination, on that gravel drive. Very few of them have wanted to go closer. Inside the hall, the master of the house was a man of about 60. His name, on paper, was Isaac Jermy. He had not been born with that name. He had been born Isaac Preston, the son of a Norwich lawyer, in the years when King George III still sat, uneasily, upon the throne. He had made a name for himself at the bar, had served for many years as the recorder of Norwich, and had, in middle age, inherited the estate at Stanfield through a tangled branch of the family. As a condition of that inheritance, he had taken the surname of the last owner, and so Preston had become Jermy. It was a common enough arrangement in his class and in his century, but it left him with a shadow he never quite outran. There were people in the county, and in the county town, who muttered that the estate had been taken by a lawyer's trick, and that the true Jermy blood ran in other men. You may have already guessed that one of those other men lived not far away. We will come to him and to his farm and to the ledger he kept in the chapters ahead. For this evening he is only a name on a lease, and a lamp burning in a farmhouse 2 miles across the fields. That is all we need him to be, for now. Isaac Jermy, the recorder, was known in Norwich as a hard sentencer and a careful man. He had a heavy face, a long jaw, and hair that had gone grey at the temples. He wore black, as men of his standing did, and he moved through his hall with the settled tread of someone who had decided, long ago, that his position was secure. In this he was mistaken, but a man cannot always feel the ground shifting under his boots. Under his roof that autumn were his son, also named Isaac, whom the household called young Mr. Jermy or Mr. Jermy Jr., and the young man's wife, Sophia. Sophia had come into the family only a short while before. She was by every account a gentlewoman, fond of her music and her needlework, still learning the corridors of a house she had not grown up in. There was a small child in the nursery, a little girl called Isabel, not yet 4 years old. There were, in addition, a governess for the child, several housemaids, a cook, a butler and his boy, a coachman, and a handful of grooms and gardeners who slept above the stables. 2 other servants matter to our story in particular, and I want to name them now, so that when they return you will know who they are. The first was Henry Yarham, a footman, a young man with a country accent and a habit of being ready before he was called. The second was Eliza Chastney, a maidservant in her 20s, employed at the hall to wait upon Sophia and to move between the family rooms and the servants' passages. She was a Norfolk girl, quick on the stairs, well liked by the cook. When you hear her name later, in the dark, you must remember that at this hour, on this evening, she was only laying out a nightgown, or trimming a wick, or carrying a jug of hot water up to a bedroom. She had not yet been called to give an account of anything at all. You do not have to hold every servant in your head. The house is holding them for us. The house is doing the remembering. We are only visiting. Come with me for a moment out of the main hall. There is a long passage that runs from the dining room to the porch, and it is lit tonight, as it is every night, by 2 lamps set on brackets against the wall. The floor is stone, worn to a soft dip in the middle by 3 centuries of feet. Along the walls are hung portraits of Jermys and Prestons, in old ruffs and old wigs, staring out at nothing in the lamplight. If you stand in the passage and listen, you can hear the clatter of plates being cleared in the kitchen, a fire settling in the grate, the small creak of a door somewhere above you as a maid moves from one room to another. That is all. That, tonight, is the whole sound of the house. Outside, the rain had begun in earnest during the afternoon and had not eased. It hissed against the stone of the porch, dripped from the ivy along the moat wall, and made pools in the ruts of the drive. The gardeners had gone in early, their boots left in a row by the scullery door. The coachman had unharnessed the last horse and settled it in the stable with a rub-down and a handful of oats. Somewhere behind the kitchen a dog barked once, twice, and then fell silent. The wind, when it came off the flats, carried the smell of wet leaves and coal smoke. You must picture, too, the county beyond the moat. Norfolk in the 1840s was not the placid patchwork of tourism posters. It was a hard, low country of poor soils and poorer wages. A ploughman in these parishes earned perhaps 8 or 9 shillings a week, if he was lucky, and lived in a cottage with a beaten earth floor and a single window. Bread had risen and fallen in price so often that year that the Norwich papers had begun to print the weekly figure at the top of the market page. There had been rick burnings in the summer, and there had been arrests, and there had been, in one village not far from Stanfield, a labourer who had walked into the workhouse rather than sit through another winter in his own cold hearth. The rich, in their halls, felt these things at a distance, as a change in the tone of the men who touched their caps to them in the lane. Inside the dining room, the family had finished their meal. It had not been an extravagant meal, a joint of mutton, a dish of potatoes, a compote of the last apples from the orchard, a decanter of port on the sideboard. Isaac Jermy sat at the head of the table in his high-backed chair. Young Mr. Jermy sat at his right hand, still in the black coat he had worn to church that Sunday. Sophia sat opposite her husband, a shawl about her shoulders against the draught from the tall window. Little Isabel had been fed earlier and was already upstairs in the nursery, being read to by her governess. The talk at the table, by every reconstruction we have, was ordinary. The weather, a tenant's request for repairs to a barn, a minor case that had come before the Norwich sessions the week before. Nothing was said that a diary would have thought worth keeping. I would like you to hold on to that if you can, because it is the truest thing about the hours before a disaster. They are, almost always, boringly like every other hour. The disaster does not announce itself. It waits. Isaac Jermy pushed back his chair, as he did every evening after the plates had been cleared. It was his custom to step through the passage to the porch, to breathe the night air for a few minutes, and to look out at the drive before the front door was bolted for the night. His son had, on other evenings, walked with him. On this evening, according to the accounts later given to the coroner, the young man remained in the hall for a moment longer, drawn back by something Sophia had said, or by a paper his father had left on the table. It is one of those tiny, ordinary choices that later becomes unbearable to think about. We must leave the dining room. The companion voice, tonight, will not walk you into the porch. That is not our threshold to cross yet. Instead, we will step, for the last time in this ordinary hour, into the room above. In the nursery, at the top of the shallow staircase, little Isabel had been put into her bed. A single candle burned on a shelf. The governess sat in a low chair by the fire, a book of moral tales open on her lap, reading in the murmur that all such women used with sleepy children. The child's dark hair spread on the pillow. Her breathing had begun, in the way of small children, to slow and deepen. She was not then, in any sense that a child understands, the last Jermy of the line. She was only a little girl in a warm bed, on a rainy night, listening to a woman read a story she had already half forgotten. Below her, along the passage, Eliza Chastney was climbing the back stairs with a jug of water for her mistress. She had paused, once, to shift the weight of the jug from one hand to the other. She could hear, faintly, the fire in the drawing-room settling as a log broke and fell. She could hear the wind against the tall window on the landing. She could not hear, and there was no reason on earth for her to have heard, the sound of a horse being tied at the far side of the moat, or the sound of a man in a long coat and a false wig walking, slowly and without hurry, up the wet drive toward the porch. I do not want to take you any closer than that tonight. This chapter is called The Quiet Before, and quiet is what I promised you. Whatever is coming, the crepe over the face, the click of the pistol in the porch lamp, the cry on the servant's stair, is coming under its own weight, and we do not have to hasten it. It has waited 178 winters. It can wait another hour. So let us stand, in imagination, back on the gravel drive, at the edge of the moat in the rain. Let us look once more at the lamp burning at the porch, at the low glow of the dining-room window, at the smaller square of the nursery light above. Let us listen, for a last time, to a house that has not yet been broken. Somewhere in the county, a church clock is striking the half-hour. Somewhere in an upper room, a candle gutters and steadies. And somewhere, along the muddy lane that runs between Stanfield Hall and a farmhouse called Potash, a lantern is beginning, very slowly, to move. A house with two names. The lantern along the lane will keep for another chapter. Before we go with it, we have to sit for a little while with a quarrel. A very English quarrel, of the kind that begins in a lawyer's chambers and ends in a graveyard. If you want a name for it, the Jermys and the men who said they should have been Jermys. If you want a picture of it, imagine a hedgerow that has been argued over for so long that no one alive can quite remember which field it belonged to first. I am going to walk you through this at a gentle pace, because it is the ground everything else stands on. If a name slips past you, do not worry. The house is holding them for us. We are only visiting. The estate at Stanfield had carried the name Jermy since the 1600s, when a family of that name held it under Charles I. Records at Norwich show the Jermys as country gentry of no great height in the world. One line held a magistracy, another had died out in the plague. One had married into the Palmers of Suffolk. They kept a pew in the parish church and a pack of harriers in the stable yard. That was, for a long while, the whole scale of their consequence. The trouble began, as it so often did in a landed family, when the last direct heir failed to leave a son. 3 men must be named now, and I will keep naming them as they return through this chapter, because they are easy to confuse, and you must not lose them. The first was Reverend George Preston, a clergyman with a comfortable living not far from Stanfield. The second was Thomas Jermy, a distant cousin of the old Jermy line, born on the wrong side of a will. The third, whom we will meet only briefly here and more darkly later, was James Blomfield Rush of Potash Farm, a man who had learned very young how to read a deed as a farmer reads a field, hunting for weakness. Reverend George Preston came into the estate around 1838. The route by which he came was not straightforward. He was a Preston by birth, but a strand of Jermy blood ran through his mother's side, and when the last of the direct line died without a son, the property passed to him, along with a condition, an old and common one, that whoever took the land must take the name. So the Reverend, on a spring morning at Norwich, laid down the name he had been baptized with, and took up the name of a house he had scarcely lived in. Parish records were altered. The family plate was re-engraved. Preston became Jermy. The county understood these arrangements. It did not always love them, because there was another line, an older, thinner, poorer line, that also called itself Jermy. Its living representative in the year we are speaking of was Thomas Jermy, a labourer of about 50, who had passed most of his life in and around a village called Bowthorpe. Thomas could not read. He could not write. He had signed his marriage in the parish register with a cross drawn by the vicar's own hand. He worked on other men's farms for a wage that varied with the season, and he lived in a cottage that leaked when the wind was in the east. Thomas Jermy believed, or had been told to believe by wiser men than himself, that the Stanfield estate was his by right. The claim went back to a will and a deed drawn up in the reign of Queen Anne, more than 130 years before. Whether the claim would have held up in a court, no one now can say with certainty. The papers were tangled, the witnesses were long dead, and the great county lawyers looked at the bundle and shook their heads. What we can say is that the claim never died. It sat like a low fever in the county. I have to admit something here, because a candid historian must. Some of what I am telling you rests on Victorian pamphlets, and Victorian pamphlets were paid for by the column inch. Where the pamphleteers agree with the trial papers and the parish books, I follow them. Where they do not, I have tried to leave the doubt in view rather than smooth it over. The record does not tell us what Thomas Jermy said, in his own words, at his own hearth, when he heard that the estate had gone once again to another man with a borrowed name. The record only tells us that he did not let the matter go. Now, we have to leave the parish register for a moment and step into a country solicitor's office in Norwich, because this is where the shadow gathers. By the 1840s, Isaac Preston, the son of the Reverend, and now Isaac Jermy the Recorder, held Stanfield Hall by inheritance from his father. He was a lawyer of the old provincial sort, careful with his papers, hard on defendants, and not much loved. He had prosecuted Chartists at the Norwich Assizes in 1839, and had passed sentences that his own townsmen thought heavy. He was proud of his position, and he was proud of the estate, and he had, by every honest account, no doubt in his own mind that both were his by right. Yet a man in his position, in that county, in that century, could not shut out the murmur beneath the hedges. That murmur had a shape, and its shape was a set of documents. In cupboards in country houses and cabinets in country attorneys, there were rumours of an older deed that would have carried the estate down through Thomas Jermy's branch of the family. There were whispers of a lost signature. Mention was made, in the guarded way of a market-day conversation, of a witness who had gone abroad in 1790-something and never returned. Every so often, when the port had gone round twice at a country dinner, a squire would turn to another squire and ask, in the low voice such things are always asked in, whether the Prestons had really settled the Jermy business, or only paid it to lie down. You do not have to remember any of those documents. You only have to remember that they were there. Let me bring in the third man, so that the ground is fully drawn. James Blomfield Rush was born a little before the turn of the century, on land not many miles from Stanfield. His mother had married a man named Blomfield, and later a man named Rush. His birth, as later inquiries would show, was itself a matter that could not be spoken of at the parish font without embarrassment. He grew up sharp, ambitious, and, on more than one account, easy with the truth in a way a farmer's boy could not usually afford to be. He learned early how the county worked, how a mortgage was drawn, how a tenancy was granted, how a lesser man might climb by knowing where the great men were weakest. By 1838, Rush had come into the notice of the elder Preston, the Reverend, and had made himself useful as an agent about the estate. He rode the boundaries. He carried messages. He walked with the surveyor. He was there, in some form, when the change of name from Preston to Jermy was being made law, and he saw from close beside the elbow of the great men exactly how such things were done, and where the ink had run. That is the part he never forgot. Rush also came to know, in the years that followed, the labourer at Bowthorpe with the cross for a signature. He visited Thomas Jermy. He listened to him. He wrote things down, in his own hand, that Thomas himself could not have read back. It is difficult to say now, at this distance, whether Rush ever meant to help Thomas honestly, or whether from the beginning he saw in the labourer a useful shape, a rival heir he could pull out of a drawer when the moment came. What we do know, from letters that later fell into court, is that Rush kept his hand in with both sides. He kept it with the Prestons, who paid him. He kept it with Thomas Jermy, who did not. The companion voice has to break in for a moment. If any of this is drifting past you, I want you to hold on to only one thing. There was a great house. There was a family in it whose right to be there was not universally believed. There was a poor cousin in a village 3 fields away who was said to be the true heir. And there was a third man in a farmhouse across the flats who knew both of them and who understood, better than any lawyer in Norwich, exactly how much a family will pay to hear the murmur go silent. We may go back to the story. Reverend George Preston, having taken the name Jermy, did not live long to enjoy it. He died in the early 1840s. The estate passed to his son Isaac. Isaac had already made his name at the bar, and now he inherited the hall, the tenants, the moat, the rents, the ledger, and, whether he cared to acknowledge it or not, the argument that had trailed the property for a century. Isaac Jermy, in the year before the murders, was in the strongest position of his life. He held the recordership of Norwich. He had a son to succeed him at Stanfield. He had a daughter-in-law and a little grandchild in the nursery. He had money enough to have lent money to men beneath him, and he had in fact lent it, some of it, as we shall shortly see, to Rush. On the surface, the old fever seemed to have burned itself out. Thomas Jermy had grown old in his cottage. The pamphlets had gone silent. The witnesses were in their graves. The recorder walked down King Street in Norwich in his black coat, and the townsmen touched their hats to him, and no one in the street said Preston out loud. Under the surface, of course, it was different, because in a country of hedgerows and enclosures, a claim to land is never simply dropped. It is folded and put in a drawer, and someone opens the drawer, later, when they need it. Rush knew where every such drawer was, in every farmhouse and every parlour for 10 miles around Stanfield. He had been in most of them himself. He had watched the deeds go in. He knew, precisely, which ones a determined man might one day take out again. I want to admit something else here, because it will matter when we come to the trial. Some of what we now say about Rush's plans in those months rests on the testimony of one witness, a young woman we have not yet met, who lived under his roof and taught his children, and who later told a court, in a shaking voice, what she had seen and what she had been told. We will meet her in the chapter after next. When she speaks, remember that hers is a single voice, and that all history is a matter of whose voice we choose to trust when only one is left standing. Even without her, the shape of it is clear enough. In the winter of 1848, the man who called himself Isaac Jermy sat at the head of a dining table in a house whose name he had taken. 2 miles across the flats, in a low farmhouse called Potash, sat a tenant of his named James Blomfield Rush. staring into a fire, with a bundle of papers on the settle beside him. Some of those papers were mortgages. Some were letters. Some of them, though the record is not entirely sure how many, were forgeries. And somewhere between the two hearths, in a labourer's cottage at Bowthorpe, sat the old man whose name they were still fighting over, warming his hands, and so far as anyone knew, taking no part in the fight at all. You must picture, if you can, the county sitting motionless under the November rain, holding all three of them at once. The great house with the borrowed name, the farmhouse with the borrowed money, the cottage with the borrowed cross. 3 hearths, 3 names, one long and unsettled question about who really held the ground beneath them. The companion voice will step back for a moment and let the house breathe. The lamps in the porch at Stanfield are still lit. The rooks are still in the oaks. The little girl in the nursery has still not been told anything about deeds or wills or cousins. She is only asleep. But in Potash Farm, on this same evening, because we must not lose the shape of the story, a man in his 40s is turning the wick of his lamp higher. He is pulling a small oaken box toward him across the table. He is unfolding, one by one, a set of documents that no one else in the county has ever seen in his hand. He is going to make sure that when Isaac Jermy calls in the mortgage on this farm, as the recorder has a lawful right to do, the ground under Isaac Jermy will already be turning. We will not go into that box tonight. We will only mark the lantern beside it, and the rain on the low roof, and the ledger open at a page of red ink. That is enough for this hour. Rest, if you can, on the sound of that rain, and on the picture of 3 hearths burning at once in a county that does not yet know how many of them will still be lit by the end of the week. The Tenant at Potash Farm. We have to leave the great house with its moat and its rooks, and follow that lantern across the flats. It is not a long walk on a map. In the wet dark of a Norfolk November, it is longer. 2 miles of lane, most of it unlit, the mud sucking at your boots at every step. If you were minded to go that way tonight, you would keep the low glimmer of Stanfield behind your left shoulder for the first field, and then you would strike out south, past a copse of alders, past a broken gate that no one had bothered to mend since the summer, and up a rise of ground that was not quite a hill. At the top of that rise stood a squat farmhouse of dark red brick, with a single lamp burning in its lower window. It was called Potash. You do not have to hold the geography in your head. The house is holding it for us. All you need to know is that Potash Farm and Stanfield Hall were near neighbours in the way of that county, close enough for a man to walk between them in an hour, and close enough for a shot in the porch of one to be heard, on a still night, on the wind by the other. The farmhouse itself was older than it looked. A stone in one of its walls carried the date 1696, though the roof had been raised a full story in the reign of King George III, and a lean-to dairy had been added at the back within living memory. It stood on 150 acres of mixed land, some barley, some pasture for a modest dairy herd, a few pigs behind the kitchen garden, and a long field of turnips that had been ploughed in that autumn. It was not a great farm. It was, in Norfolk terms, a decent working holding, the sort of place a thrifty yeoman might have handed down to his son. It had not, however, been handed to the man who now sat inside it, warming his hands at the fire. He had bought it. I want you to picture the man, because we have to spend the rest of this hour in his company, and it is easier to sit near someone when you have their face in mind. James Blomfield Rush was 48 years old that November. He was broad in the chest and thick in the neck, with the kind of build a countryman keeps into middle age if he does not drink his farm away. His hair was thinning at the crown and had gone iron in colour. He wore side whiskers, in the fashion of the market towns, and he kept them trimmed close. His hands were large and reddish at the knuckles, marked by weather and by rope work. He dressed better than a labourer and worse than a gentleman, a black coat that had once been good, a waistcoat of dark cloth, a stock at his throat that he retied himself each morning without a mirror. His eyes were pale and set a little close together, and did not rest for long on the person he was speaking to. That is how his neighbours later remembered him, when a man in a wig at a country magistrate's bench asked them what he had looked like. You must not, though, imagine a monster in the firelight. Not yet. On this evening he was, to any eye that walked into the room, only a farmer at his ledger. A jug of ale stood at his elbow. A dog with a grey muzzle lay across his boots. The fire had been built up against the damp, and the smell of the kitchen, bread from the morning, onions from a supper stew, the sharp note of tallow from a fresh candle, hung in the low room. It is important that I say something here, and it is the sort of thing a candid historian ought to say more often. Almost everything we know about the household at Potash in these last weeks before the killings comes to us through a handful of witnesses, one of whom would soon have very powerful reasons to protect herself in court, and another of whom would be trying, from the dock, to save his own neck. The record is thinner than the Victorian pamphlets pretended. Where a Victorian writer would give you the exact turn of Rush's expression as he opened a letter, I can give you only what a servant later swore she had seen through a half-open door, or what a magistrate later wrote in a summary he compiled from a dozen conflicting statements. Please carry that doubt with you as we go on. It does not make the story less true. It only reminds us that we are peering through keyholes, not standing in the room. Rush had come into possession of Potash Farm in 1846, 2 years before this evening. He had bought it for a sum that the Norwich papers later fixed at just under £4,000. To hear that figure spoken aloud, you must translate it into the world it belonged to. A Norfolk ploughman in that year earned, as I said before, perhaps 9 shillings a week. A schoolmaster in Wymondham might earn £80 a year, if the parish was generous. A country parson in a middling living took home 200 and thought himself comfortable. £4,000 was, therefore, more than any man in that room, ledger or no ledger, was ever going to see rise honestly out of 150 acres of Norfolk soil. Rush had not, of course, £4,000 of his own. Almost no one who bought a farm in that county in that year did. He had a deposit scraped together from earlier dealings, some cattle bought and sold, some grain speculated on at the Norwich Corn Hall, a legacy from a relation whose exact identity the record has never quite pinned down. The rest he had borrowed. The bulk of the loan, near £5,000 when the additional advances were counted in, had come from Isaac Jermy at Stanfield Hall. You may hear that figure and want to stop the tape a moment, as it were, and turn it in the light. So do I. Isaac Jermy, recorder of Norwich, master of the estate over the moat, a man not known to give his money away, had lent £5,000 to a farmer of no great family, on the security of one Norfolk holding. It was not a mad loan. Potash Farm was worth it, if the price of corn held and the rains came at the right hour, and the pigs did not take a fever. But it was a loan that gave the borrower very little air to breathe. Interest fell due each year. Repayments of the principal had been agreed in fixed stages. The whole arrangement was written into a bundle of legal papers that Rush kept in an iron-bound box on a shelf beside the parlour door. The tenant at Potash was, in law, both an owner and a debtor. He owned the farm. He owed on the farm. And the man to whom he owed was the man on whose land his forge, his lane and his barns had stood before he had ever put his own hand to them. Come with me for a moment away from the fire, out into the yard, because I want you to feel the pressure of the year on this house from every side. Beyond the kitchen door was a cobbled yard, uneven under the boots, with a pump at its centre and a low wall along one edge that gave onto the muck heap. The rain had turned everything to a thin brown slick. 2 horses stood in the stable behind, one of them lame that week from a splinter in the near fore. In the sty, 3 pigs had already been fattened for the Christmas market, and a 4th had died of a bloat 3 days before and been buried, at some loss, behind the orchard. In the barn were sacks of oats and a bin of turnips. In the dairy hung 2 brass pans that a maid scoured each morning with sand from the yard. It was, from any angle a stranger might see it, a working, competent farm. It was also, on paper, mortgaged to the last penny it could bear. That was the shape of Rush's life in the autumn of 1848. He had a farm that fed him. He had a family under his roof, several children of his own, ranging in age from a boy near 20 to an infant not yet weaned. He had a housekeeper of long standing, a woman named Mary Wells, who ran the kitchen with a heavy hand and did not much like her master. He had labourers who came in at first light and left at dusk, and who touched their caps to him because he paid them, more or less on time. And he had, sitting in the iron-bound box at his elbow, a bundle of papers that said that on the last day of that November, the year of grace 1848, a considerable sum would fall, due to Isaac Jermy at Stanfield Hall, and that if it was not paid, the farm, house, barns, cobbles, pump, brass pans and all, would become the property of the recorder. I have to admit one more gap here, because it matters. We do not know, and we will never know, what precisely passed through Rush's mind when he first understood that he was not going to be able to meet that call. The record does not tell us the date on which the thought crystallized. It does not tell us whether he sat up a whole night with it, or whether it settled on him across a week, as a fever settles. 2 witnesses later gave different accounts of the hour in which he first spoke of it aloud. Both of them were certain. Both of them cannot have been right. What we can say, from letters and from the ledger itself, is that Rush had begun by the summer of that year to lean harder on every corner of his business. He pressed his tenants for arrears. He sold 2 cows earlier than he ought to have done. He borrowed a smaller sum, at a bad rate, from a country attorney in Attleborough, and used it to pay the interest owed at Stanfield, so that Isaac Jermy could not yet call the loan in full. He wrote to a distant cousin in London, asking for the return of an old obligation, and received no reply. He walked the boundary of Potash twice in a single week, as if the fields might have produced an answer overnight. They had not. The companion voice ought to slow you down here, because this is the crucial thing to feel. A man who cannot pay a debt of that size, in that county, in that century, is not merely an embarrassed man. He is a man about to lose everything he can put a hand on. The farm, the livestock, the roof over his children, the name he had bought in the market square, along with the deeds. Potash Farm had made James Blomfield Rush, in the eyes of Wymondham, into something more than the odd son of an odd marriage. Losing Potash would put him back into a life he had, for 20 years, been climbing away from. There was, however, another road, and it is now that we have to speak of it, even at a distance. Rush had been drawing up, in his own hand, and on paper he had purchased for the purpose, a second bundle of documents. It was a bundle that did not appear in the mortgage box on the parlour shelf. It lived in a different drawer, in the room off the kitchen that he used as his office. It contained, when the constables later opened it, deeds and letters and endorsements bearing names that had no business being together on the same page. The name of Isaac Jermy the recorder. The name of the Reverend George Preston, dead these several years. The name of Thomas Jermy, the labourer of Bowthorpe, whose signature, if he could be said to have one at all, was only ever the mark of a hand that had not learned to write, and, threaded through them, in a hand that resembled several different men, and yet resembled none of them exactly, the same sloping letters, over and over. We will meet those papers in their proper place. For tonight, all you need to know is that they existed, and that they were meant to save Potash Farm at the expense of Stanfield Hall, and that no man who understood the law of Norfolk in 1848 could have believed for a moment that they would survive an honest reading. Rush closed the ledger. He set the pen down. He drew the candle nearer, so that its light fell on the iron-bound box on the shelf and on the smaller drawer in the corner. His dog shifted at his boots. Mary Wells, the housekeeper, moved through the passage above him with a bundle of linen and did not come down. Somewhere in the upper rooms, one of the younger children began to cry, and was hushed by a servant girl before the sound could carry. A house that is only itself on an ordinary wet evening sounds like this. A dog turning on the boards. A pot cooling in the kitchen. A child comforted upstairs. It sounds like 10,000 other Norfolk farms on 10,000 other November nights, and it is easy, at this distance, to forget what a piece of luck it is to be inside a house that has no reason to fear the morning. Potash Farm, on this particular evening, was not such a house. Isaac Jermy, on the other side of the fields, had already sent word by his attorney that the coming quarter day would be a hard one. He was not, in that letter, cruel. He was only exact. He was a recorder, and he had lent money as a recorder lends money, and the day named in the bond was the day he expected to be paid. It is possible, if the record allowed us to say so, that in another year he might have been persuaded to grant an extension. In this year, with the county in the state it was in, and his own son's future in his mind, he had decided that he would not. That decision, taken in a lawyer's office in Norwich, and written out in a neat clerkly hand, is the thing that would soon reach across the fields and change everything that could be changed at Stanfield. Rush knew that letter. He had read it more than once. He had folded it and put it back in the box, and then taken it out and read it again. In the pale flat of his eyes, on this evening, there was no wildness yet. There was only calculation and the very particular tiredness of a man who has decided that a course of action is no longer avoidable, and is thinking, in a practical way, about the tools he will need. We must leave him at the ledger. It is not right for us to sit any longer at his elbow. The dog will settle. The candle will burn down. The rain will keep on against the low roof of the farmhouse until well past midnight, and then it will slacken, and by dawn a thin frost will lie along the tops of the hedges, as far as the moat at Stanfield. Before you drift, hold this in your mind. In one Norfolk house, on this same wet night, an old lawyer is sealing a letter that will fall due at the end of the month. In another Norfolk house, 2 miles off, a tenant is folding away a bundle of papers he has forged. And on a road not yet travelled, in a coach from London that has not yet been ordered, a young woman is about to be written to. She teaches French and a little music and the letters of the alphabet to small hands that cannot yet hold a pen. Her name is Emily Sandford. She has never heard of Potash Farm. She has never heard of Stanfield Hall. She has certainly never heard of James Blomfield Rush. That is about to change. The Governess in the attic. Writing chapter 4 now. The letter that brought her went out from Potash Farm in the late summer of 1847, and I want you to imagine, before we follow it, the small effort involved in the sending. Rush wrote it himself, in the room off the kitchen he called his office, using a nib he had trimmed that morning at the table. He addressed it to a house in the north of London, in a district of neat brick terraces that had gone up within living memory on ground that had been market gardens when his own mother was a girl. He paid the postage in advance, which was the newer habit of a man who wished to look respectable. He carried it into Wymondham himself, and set it into the hand of the postmaster, and turned home along the wet lane with his mind, for once, not on his ledger. The letter was answered within a fortnight. The reply, when it came back to Potash, was written in a hand so careful and so upright that Rush later kept it in the same drawer where he kept his forgeries, though the two documents had nothing else in common. It was the hand of a young woman named Emily Sandford, and she wrote to say that she would come. I should say who she was, because the county did not know her, and the county would very soon be talking of little else. Emily Sandford was 22 years old that autumn. She was the daughter of respectable people in reduced circumstances, her father a schoolmaster of modest income, her mother the daughter of a clergyman with a country parish in Kent. She had been raised on the edge of gentility, which is a phrase that meant, in that century, that she had been taught French and a little music, and how to hold her spine straight at table, and then had been sent out into the world with none of the fortune that would have kept her at home. There were many young women in England of exactly her situation. They filled the schoolrooms of country houses from Northumberland to the Kentish coast. They wrote long letters to their mothers and read them by the light of one candle in an attic bedroom. They were, by the sober count of the census takers, one of the largest professions in the kingdom, and one of the most invisible. Her looks, so far as the record allows me to describe them, were pleasant rather than striking. She was of middling height, brown-haired, with a wide, serious mouth and grey eyes that a court reporter, later, would call unafraid. She dressed simply, in the way a governess had to dress, dark stuffs, a plain collar, a cap in the mornings, because a governess who dressed better than her mistress lost her position within the quarter. She had, at the moment of her hiring, a small trunk of clothes, a workbox with her mother's initials picked out in the lid, a Bible she had been given at confirmation, and about £4 in coin, which was the whole of her savings from her last situation. She had never been in Norfolk before. She had never been on a farm. She travelled down by coach and by rail, in the manner of that year. The London and Norwich line had been open only since 1845, and it was still a great matter for a young woman with a single trunk to take herself and her possessions to Bishopsgate Station in the morning dark, and to sit for the greater part of the day on a hard bench in a second-class carriage, with the fields of Essex sliding past the window and the smoke of the engine drifting back over her shoulder. At Norwich she was met, not by Rush, but by a boy from Potash driving a small trap. The boy was perhaps 14, in a coat that had once belonged to an older brother, and he did not know how to speak to her, and so he did not speak to her at all. He took her trunk. He handed her up. He clicked at the horse. The city fell behind them within a mile. We do not have her own words for that drive. The letters she wrote home in the first weeks at Potash have not survived, burned, most likely, at some later date by a relation who wished to protect the family name, and by the time she came to give evidence in a court, her account of everything before the murders had already been polished, several times, by the sort of gentleman who took shorthand for a living. What we do have, from a single sentence in a later interview she gave to a Norwich clergyman, is the observation that on the road out from the city, she had been struck by the flatness of the country, and by the size of the sky, and by how much of that sky was rain. Potash Farm, when she came into its yard for the first time, was in the last light of an October afternoon. She stepped down from the trap into the mud. She looked up at the low red bricks and the deep eaves. She would have seen, in one narrow window under the roof, a candle that had already been lit against the coming dark. That candle was for her. It burned in the room that would be hers, a plain chamber under the eaves, whitewashed to the beams, with an iron bedstead, a washstand, a hanging shelf, and a strip of drugget on the floor. It was called in the household the attic room, though it was not properly an attic, only an upper story pinched by the pitch of the roof. It would be her home for the next 14 months, and it is the room she is best remembered by. When a Victorian pamphleteer wanted to sell a shilling account of the case, he called it the Governess in the attic, and the phrase stuck to her long after she was dead. Rush met her at the kitchen door. He shook her hand, in the way a man shakes the hand of a servant he wishes to treat as slightly more than a servant. He asked after her journey. He introduced her to Mary Wells, the housekeeper, who did not smile. He introduced her to the children, one by one, in the parlour, a row of pale faces from perhaps 18 down to 5, the elder ones already old enough to measure her, the younger ones already tired at that hour of the evening. Their mother, Rush's wife, was not there. She had been dead some years by then, of a decline the doctor had been unable to name, and it was in her place, in a manner of speaking, that Emily Sandford had been brought under this roof. I want to slow down here, because if you are drifting, this is a thing worth catching. A young woman had been hired to teach a farmer's children on a Norfolk holding 2 miles from Stanfield Hall. That, on its face, was all that had happened. In the eyes of Wymondham, and of the county, and of Emily's own family, that was what she was, a governess in her first country situation, doing what many hundreds of young women were doing that same week in that same kingdom. What no one in the parlour on that October evening yet understood, and what Emily herself would only piece together over the winter that followed, was that the man who had hired her had already begun to consider her use to him in a second, quieter capacity, one that had nothing to do with the schoolroom, and everything to do with the drawer in the office off the kitchen. You do not need to hold every detail of the household at once. Rest for a moment on the shape of it. A widower in middle age. Several children, some almost grown. A housekeeper who ran the kitchen and did not conceal her dislike of the master. A brace of labourers who came in at first light. A dog on the hearth, And now, at the top of the stairs, a young woman from London with a workbox and a Bible and a small savings of £4, unpacking her trunk in a room that had been made ready for her, and looking out through the narrow window at a flat black landscape whose place names she did not yet know. The routine into which Emily fell was not, in its first weeks, unusual. She rose before 6. She dressed by the light of a candle. She ate breakfast in the kitchen with the children. She took the younger ones through their letters at a table set up in a corner of the parlour, and the elder through their French and their arithmetic. She walked with them in the lanes when the rain allowed it. She mended their clothes in the evenings. She sat at supper with Rush and the elder children, and afterwards she went up to her room and wrote letters and read the Bible and slept. If that had been all of it, we should never have heard her name. It was not all of it, of course. From very early in her stay, how early is one of the things her later testimony did not perfectly agree with itself about, Rush began to single her out. He would ask her to remain in the parlour after the children had gone up, on the pretext of some question about their lessons. He would show her the ledger and speak of the farm and the mortgage and the letter from Stanfield he had put back in the box. He would tell her, in a low voice by the fire, that he was a man beset. He would ask her opinion, in the way a man asks the opinion of someone whose opinion he has no intention of taking, and he would seem to listen. He was practised at this. He had been practised at it for a long time. The historical record does not tell us the hour at which she first realised that his interest in her was not paternal, and I will not invent it. What her later evidence did establish, in a court that pressed her hard on every point of it, was that within some months of her arrival, Rush had begun to speak to her of marriage. He told her, first, that he intended to make her his wife when a proper interval had passed. He told her, later, that a form of private ceremony between the two of them would be enough in the eyes of God, if not of the county. He drew up, in his own hand, a paper he called a marriage contract, and he read it to her by the fire, and he asked her to sign it. She signed it. Whether she believed at that moment that she was safely married, or whether she already suspected that the paper was a fiction meant to buy her silence, that is a thing she was asked, again and again, in a courtroom at Norwich, and her answer was never entirely the same twice. I have to be plain about what happened after that, because the case turns on it, and yet I do not want to be unkind to a young woman who was dead within 20 years and left few enough defenders while she lived. From some time in the winter of 1847, Emily Sandford was Rush's mistress, in fact, whatever she was in the eyes of the law. She was, at the same time, still the governess to his children. She still ate at his table. She still walked the lanes with the little ones on Sundays. She still climbed the stairs each night to the plain room under the roof. From the outside, the household looked as it always had. From the inside, a young woman who had come from a London terrace to teach French to a farmer's daughters had become tangled, before she had properly understood what was happening to her, into the private business of a man who was moving, drawer by drawer, toward a crime. The companion voice must sit with this for a moment. It is easy, at this distance, to blame her. Victorian pamphlets did, in their thousands, and they made a good deal of money from doing so. It is easy, from a bedroom that has a lamp of its own and a door that locks from the inside, to say what she ought to have done, and when, and how loudly. Try, if you can, to sit in the attic room at Potash instead. A young woman, 22 years old, in a county whose lanes she did not know, in a country of hedgerows where a governess without a character was a governess without a wage, with £4 in a work-box, and no one within a day's travel to whom she could honestly turn. She stayed because staying was, in the practical sense, the only door in the wall. That does not excuse what she came, later, to do and to hide for a man who did not deserve it. It only reminds us that she was very young and very alone and very far from Kent. Through the spring and summer of 1848, the routine of the house held its shape. Emily taught the children. Mary Wells ran the kitchen, and grew a shade more disapproving each month, and said nothing to anyone that mattered. Rush rode the boundary. Rush met his attorney in Attleborough. Rush wrote letters in the office off the kitchen with the door not entirely closed. From her seat in the parlour, over her mending, Emily could see him at his desk in the lamplight, bent over papers she was not asked to read. She noticed, without at first knowing what she was noticing, that some of those papers were older than they ought to have been. Ink that had been fresh a week before was pale by Sunday. Signatures at the foot of one letter matched, a little too neatly, signatures on a document that had been written years before the letter's date. She said nothing. She had not been asked. By the autumn, the letters and the visits had grown thicker. Rush went into Norwich more often and came back later. He kept the office door shut now. He brought home, one evening in October, a small parcel wrapped in brown paper that he took upstairs without opening in front of anyone. He asked Mary Wells, the housekeeper, for the loan of a black wig that had belonged to his late wife's brother, an actor by trade, and had been kept, for reasons no one remembered, in a trunk in the box room. Mary Wells fetched the wig and looked at him hard as she gave it over and said nothing. He did not explain. Emily, in the parlour that same week, was asked by her master to sit with him after the children had gone up. He did not, this time, show her the ledger. He said, in a voice she later remembered as very level, that a great business was in hand which would settle every difficulty of the farm before the month was out. He said that she was to trust him. He said that whatever she might hear on the 28th day of November, she was to say, if any person asked her, that he had been at Potash Farm the whole of that evening and had not stirred from the house. She looked at him across the fire. The dog turned on the hearth. The candle guttered and steadied. She did not, so far as any court could later prove, ask him what he meant. That silence, held for a few seconds in a Norfolk parlour on a wet October night, is the seam along which the rest of this story runs. In the drawer in the office, the forged papers were already almost ready. In the box room, the black wig lay folded on top of the actor's coat. In a lawyer's office in Norwich, a letter was being copied out in a clerk's neat hand that would fall due at Potash on the last day of the month. And above them all, in a plain chamber under the eaves, a young woman was climbing the stairs to bed, with a workbox on her arm and a Bible under it, and no clear idea, yet, how far she had already walked into the dark. The forged papers. We must go back down, past the door of the attic room, past the small landing where the boards creaked in a shape the household knew by heart, and stand once more at the doorway of the office off the kitchen. The candle at that desk has been burning a good deal longer than the one under the eaves. If you are still with me, take a seat by the hearth in the parlour next door, and let the fire settle, and try to see what a young woman going up to bed did not quite see through the half-open door. The room itself was hardly a room at all. It had been carved out of a wider passage in the last century, when someone at Potash had wanted a place to keep a farm ledger away from the noise of the kitchen. It measured perhaps 9 feet by 7. It held one desk of dark oak, cut down from a larger table and set against the wall under a narrow window. It held one chair, a hard one, with a cushion of black horsehair worn thin at the seat. It held 2 shelves of books, mostly agricultural, Loudon on farming, a Norfolk almanac for 1846, a bound volume of the Farmer's Magazine, a battered copy of the Book of Common Prayer that had belonged to Rush's mother. It held one iron-bound box on the top shelf. It held one drawer in the desk, fitted with a lock that turned with a key Rush carried on a thong at his waist. That drawer is the object of this hour. James Blomfield Rush had begun the work in it, so far as the record allows me to say, in the early autumn of 1848. He had not begun the thought behind it then. The thought had been in his mind, in some form, for the better part of a year, growing as a mould grows behind panelling, invisible at first, then a shadow, then a stain. What began in the autumn was the paperwork itself. The turning of the mind into ink. I should tell you what those papers were meant to prove, because their whole design lay in a claim about the past. And I have to admit, before we go on, that the exact order in which Rush drew them up is one of the things the historians never quite settled. The bundle was opened by a magistrate after the murders, listed, sealed and carried to Norwich, and there parts of it were transcribed, and parts of it were later mislaid. What follows is the shape of the scheme as the trial and the coroner's inquest between them put it together, and where that shape is uncertain, I will say so. The Jermys had held Stanfield Hall for a generation. They had come into the estate in the 1830s by a route that involved a change of surname, a will contested and rewritten, and a distant cousin of the labouring sort in the parish of Bowthorpe, whose interest in the property had, in the eyes of most Norfolk lawyers, been thoroughly settled and paid off. That labourer, Thomas Jermy, who could not properly read or write, is a name to hold in mind. He is not the villain of this story. He is barely a figure at all. He is a man who worked in the fields and drew a small allowance, and had almost nothing to do with the great house whose name he shared. Rush had met him. Rush had, in the low way of the man, made himself agreeable to him. The scheme, at its heart, was to prove that Isaac Jermy the recorder had never had a proper title to Stanfield Hall in the first place, that Thomas Jermy of Bowthorpe was the true heir, and that Rush himself, by an agreement freshly discovered in a locked box, held a lease and other rights that would make him the effective master of the estate, and would wipe out at a single stroke the mortgage debt he owed. It would not, in one blow, ruin the Jermys and enrich the tenant of Potash farm. That was the shape of it. That was what the drawer contained. To make the scheme work, Rush needed several things on paper. He needed an old deed, dated years earlier, in which Isaac Jermy appeared to acknowledge Thomas Jermy's claim. He needed a letter, in the hand of the Reverend George Preston, a clergyman of that parish, dead these several years, whose signature could no longer be defended by its owner, witnessing the acknowledgement. He needed a lease between Thomas Jermy and himself, granting him the use and profit of Stanfield Hall for a long term of years, at a rent so low that no honest man would ever have agreed to it. And he needed a note, in Thomas Jermy's own name, transferring certain further rights to him for reasons the note did not quite explain. Every single one of those documents was to be written by Rush's own hand. You may want to sit forward at this. Or rather, if you are drifting, do not. Let the picture come to you as you lie there, without moving. A middle-aged farmer, at a desk under a narrow window. A single candle. A row of nibs on a tray. 2 inkwells at his elbow, one of them older and browner than the other. Sheets of paper of different weights, some of them yellowed at the edges, bought, second-hand, from a stationer in Norwich who dealt in old stock. A small dish of sand for blotting, a knife for scraping, and, beside all of it, a folded sheet on which he had, for weeks, been practising a signature. Not one signature. Several. Isaac Jermy's. George Preston's. Thomas Jermy's mark. Over and over and over, in the way a child practices the letters of the alphabet, until the hand no longer thinks about the shape it is making. He was, in his way, patient with it. Forgery of this sort is not the work of an afternoon. It is the work of many evenings. A letter written wet, then dried too fast in front of the fire, will not pass. A signature drawn in one confident sweep will show a stranger's confidence, not the honest hesitations of the hand it means to copy. Ink mixed too dark will look nothing like ink that has sat under glass in a country vestry for 18 years. Rush had learned, or thought he had learned, how to age a page. He rubbed one edge with a cloth dipped in cold tea. He held another over a candle at a careful distance, until a faint brown wash spread across the paper. He folded a third along a crease he had already worn into it by drawing his thumbnail down the fold a dozen times. When he had finished with each, he laid it on the shelf inside the iron box and closed the lid. If you have ever tried to write in another person's hand, you will know how strange the muscle of the wrist becomes. Rush had begun with the signatures. He had copies of real ones, a letter from Isaac Jermy that had come with the mortgage, a receipt in Preston's hand that a neighbour had lent him on a pretence, a scrap with Thomas Jermy's mark on it from a parish paper. He laid these under a fresh sheet, held them to the window for the light to shine through, and traced. Then he laid them aside and did it again, this time from the practised memory of the hand. Then, Only then did he put the fresh signature at the foot of a forged deed and hope. I have to admit one more gap. We do not know how many of the practice sheets he burned. He must have burned some. The magistrate's list, taken after the murders, contained perhaps a dozen finished documents. It did not contain the failed drafts. Either he had disposed of them before the constables came, which was likely, or he had never kept them at all, which was less likely. Somewhere in the ash pit at the back of Potash, in the autumn of 1848, there was a great deal of paper that no historian would ever read. That absence is part of the story. The strangest of the forged papers when the court in the end examined them was the lease from Thomas Jermy to Rush himself. A lease of that size would ordinarily have been drawn by a solicitor, engrossed on parchment, signed in the presence of witnesses in a lawyer's office in Norwich, and copied into a book. This one had been done at a farmhouse desk on ordinary paper by a man in a hurry. It set out a rent of £5 a year for the use of an estate that returned £500. It gave the tenant of Potash Farm the right to collect all the rents of Stanfield Hall for a term of 99 years. It bore, at its foot, the mark of Thomas Jermy, and beside that mark, the names of 2 witnesses who did not, when they were later asked, know that they had ever witnessed such a thing. Come back with me to the parlour for a moment. Emily Sandford, the young governess from Kent, was not in the office off the kitchen while the papers were being made. She was, most evenings, in the parlour with the elder children over their lessons, or at the small table with a bit of mending, or already upstairs. She would have heard, through the wall, the scrape of the nib and the creak of the chair. She would have seen, when she brought Rush a candle he had asked for, the sheets on the desk and the little dish of sand. He did not lock the drawer while she was in the room, and he did not always close the folder over the sheet he was writing. She was a young woman with wits enough to know that a man does not usually write out the same signature 9 times in an evening. And yet, when she was later asked whether she had ever known what he was about, her answer was a hesitation and a shaking of the head, and then a fresh sentence that was not quite an answer. It is a hard thing, at 22, to name aloud what you have half seen through a door. Let me be candid about that too. There are 2 ways to read Emily Sandford in these weeks. One is that she was a young woman utterly deceived, who saw nothing because she could not bear to see, and who signed a paper called a marriage contract because a man old enough to be her father had told her that God was watching. The other is that she saw more than she later cared to admit, and hoped, in the way of the trapped, that if she looked away long enough, the shape at the desk would somehow rearrange itself into something honest. Both of those readings appear in the trial record. Both were argued for, hard, by different men in wigs. I do not think we can decide between them at this distance, and I would rather not pretend that we can. Rush was not, in any case, working only with pen and paper. Somewhere in the middle of that autumn, the exact evening the record does not fix, he began to make preparations of a different kind. He fetched down, from the box room, a black wig that had once belonged to his late wife's brother, an actor by trade, whose name has not survived in the parish books. He took a strip of black crepe, of the sort used for mourning bands, and cut it into a rough veil. He took a pistol from a chest in the office, oiled it, and set it aside on a shelf. He took a heavy horseman's cloak from a peg by the back door, and folded it, and put it away in a place it did not usually live. He asked one of his sons, quite casually, whether the pistol in the chest had ever been used since he had bought it, and did not seem to mind that the answer was no. The companion voice must slow us here, because a jump is coming, and it is one I do not want you to miss. Everything we have watched Rush do so far, the ledger, the drawer, the traced signatures, the aged paper, the borrowed wig, has been the work of a man preparing a story. A story about a will, about a claim, about a lease. Stories can be told in court. They can be argued over by lawyers for weeks. They can be believed or they can be laughed at, and either way no one need die. The trouble, as Rush had known for some months by then, was that his particular story would not survive the presence in the world of the 2 men who could most easily contradict it. Isaac Jermy the recorder would, on any honest morning, produce his own deeds and his own witnesses, and dismantle the forgeries in an afternoon. Isaac Jermy the younger, his son, the heir, would, in his turn, take up the case with the same quiet ruthlessness. As long as father and son were both in the world, Potash Farm was lost. That was the arithmetic of the drawer in the office. That was why, beside the papers, there lay a wig and a veil and a pistol on an oiled cloth. Rush had begun with a fraud. He had come, by careful degrees across the autumn, to the point where the fraud would only stand up if two men could be prevented from opening their mouths to answer it. What was underway at Potash by the end of October 1848 was no longer a scheme of paper alone. The month turned. The days shortened. The rain came in from the sea with a new edge to it, and the labourers in the yard stamped their boots at the door before they came into the kitchen for their tea. Somewhere, in a lawyer's office in Norwich, the letter fixing the last day of November as the day of reckoning had been sealed and sent. Somewhere in the great house at Stanfield, Isaac Jermy sat down to his supper in a dining room whose curtains had been drawn against the wet. In the box room at Potash, the black wig lay across the folded cloak, and the pistol on its cloth caught the light of a candle as the door was pulled to. Emily Sandford climbed the stairs to the plain room under the eaves and set her workbox on the shelf, and unlaced her boots by the iron bed, and blew out her candle without looking, for once, at the flat black sky beyond the narrow window. 2 miles off, along a lane that would soon be walked in the wet by a figure in a wig and a veil, the lamps at Stanfield Hall had already been lit for the evening. The month was almost gone. The last day of November was nearly at the door, the night of the 28th. There is a habit, in a house on a working farm, of watching the light go before the light has really gone. Supper at Potash, on the evening of the 28th of November 1848, was served early, before 6, in the room off the kitchen where the family took most of its meals. Emily Sandford sat at one end of the long table with the youngest of the children beside her, spooning up a broth she had helped Mary Wells to season an hour before. James Blomfield Rush sat at the other end, opposite the window, and he ate less than he usually did. He asked, once, for the salt. He did not, so far as anyone at that table later remembered, ask for anything else. Outside, the rain had thickened. It had begun in the middle afternoon as a fine wet drift out of the east, of the sort a Norfolk farmer scarcely bothered to name. By dusk it had grown heavier, and by the hour they lit the candles it was falling in a steady sheet across the yard, hissing on the pump handle, and running off the eaves into the muddy channel by the wall. A wind had come up with it. The apple tree at the corner of the garden creaked. The dog by the hearth stirred once and lay down again. I want you to see the room as it was at that hour, because the whole of what follows turns on the shortness of the distance between an ordinary supper and the porch of a great house. A row of pewter mugs on the shelf. A loaf on a wooden board. A little pile of mending on the settle where Emily had left it in the afternoon. A copy of a Norwich newspaper folded on the arm of a chair. 6 or 7 souls at a table, and a hearth fire that had been fed within the last quarter of an hour. Nothing in that room was out of the ordinary. Nothing in it foretold what its master was about to walk out into. Rush left the table just after 7. He said, without looking up, that he had business in the office and did not want to be disturbed. Mary Wells cleared the plates in a hush she was practised at holding. Emily took the children up to the parlour to read to them from a book of Bible stories they had been steadily working through since Michaelmas. The office door closed. The key turned in it once. For perhaps 3/4 of an hour, no one in the house heard him move. What he did in that space we can, from the evidence at the scene, mostly piece together. He fetched the black wig from the box room and drew it down over his own greying hair. He fastened the strip of crepe, folded and stitched at one edge, so that it hung across the upper part of his face, leaving only a slit for the eyes and the mouth uncovered. He took the heavy horseman's cloak from its peg and put it about his shoulders. Under it he wore the same coat he had worn at supper and the same boots. He took the pistol he had oiled the week before and slid it into a holster of his own making inside the cloak. He took a second pistol, of a heavier bore, and set it in the other side. He took a lantern with the shutter half drawn. He let himself out at the back door of the office, into the yard, without going through the kitchen. The record is not perfectly certain of the hour at which he left the yard. The kitchen clock at Potash, which had lost time all autumn, gave one figure to the men who came in the morning. Mary Wells, questioned in the parlour a day later, gave another. What the trial in the end settled on was that between 8 and past, in a wind that carried the rain almost sideways across the flats, a figure in a long cloak with a lantern shuttered to a thread of light stepped out of the farmyard at Potash and turned along the lane towards Stanfield Hall. We have walked that lane already, in an earlier hour. I do not want to walk you along it again, tonight, in company with what was moving along it then. Take it, instead, from the other end. Stand for a moment in the porch at Stanfield. The great house that night was doing what it did every night at that hour. The dining room had been cleared, and Isaac Jermy the recorder, 60 years old, tall, a little stooped in the shoulder, in the black stock and coat he had worn at the assizes that week, had come out into the porch to take his evening air, as he did after every meal. It was a habit of 30 years. The porch at Stanfield was deep, with a stone bench inside it, and it faced south across the drive toward the row of limes. Rain fell steadily beyond its arch. Somewhere in the yard a horse shifted in its stall. In the passage behind him, a housemaid crossed with a candle. In the drawing room above, his son and his son's young wife sat over a book. Upstairs, in a room at the end of the west passage, the child in the nursery had been asleep for an hour. I have to admit that no one in the porch at Stanfield saw the figure step in out of the drive. There was later an argument between two of the servants about a shape in the dark under the limes a moment before, but neither of them had been certain enough to speak of it at the time, and I would not lean on their memory now. What the porch itself received was a click of a hammer on flint, and then a report that the old stone threw back off its arch as a single flat crack, and then a stillness. Isaac Jermy fell where he stood. The ball had gone into the chest, above the heart. He did not cry out. He did not, so far as the doctor could later tell, live long enough to know what had struck him. The lantern in the porch guttered in a draught that had not been there a moment before. A footman in the hall, 3 yards behind the inner door, heard the shot and stood, for perhaps 2 seconds, quite still. You have to know the geometry to see what happened next, and I will keep it as easy on the ear as I can. The porch opened into a wide inner hall, panelled to head height, with a stair rising on the right to the first floor, and a passage running to the left toward the servants' quarters. From the drawing room above the porch, a second stair came down into that same hall by the newel post. Isaac Jermy the younger, 30 years old that year, had heard the shot from where he sat with his wife Sophia. He had risen at once. He had come out of the drawing room, down the newel stair, and was at the foot of it in the hall, unarmed, when the figure in the cloak came in from the porch through the inner door. There was again no exchange of words that the record has preserved. There was a second report, from a heavier pistol than the first. Isaac Jermy the younger, who had married Sophia 3 years before, who had a daughter of 2 years asleep upstairs in the west nursery, went down at the foot of the newel stair, with a wound in the body from which he did not rise. The house, in that instant, ceased to be a house of an ordinary evening and became something else, and I have to slow down for a breath here, because if you are drifting towards sleep, it is at exactly this hinge that the words matter. Nothing loud follows. There is no shouting from the figure in the cloak. There is no screaming from the passages above. There is a very particular kind of hush that falls on a great house when 2 shots have been fired inside it, and then the human noises begin, one at a time, out of the further rooms. The footman in the hall did not move to the figure. He moved back, through a door into a service passage, and then out at a side door into the wet yard, and then along the lane at a run in the direction of the rectory. That was, in the end, the beginning of the alarm. It would not reach a magistrate for some time yet. Sophia Jermy came down the newel stair a moment later. She had heard her husband fall. She had, in her own later account, believed at first that he had slipped on the tread. She was 29 years old, in a dress of dark stuff with a shawl about her shoulders, and she was carrying a candle in a brass stick. She reached the foot of the stair, saw what lay there, and turned toward the porch. The figure in the cloak had not yet gone. There was, from the far side of the hall, a third report. The ball took her in the arm, high, near the shoulder. The candle went out. She fell against the panelling and slid to the floor beside her husband, and did not, in that hour, entirely lose consciousness. Along the servants' passage that ran from the hall toward the back stair, Eliza Chastney was already coming forward. She was a housemaid in her early 20s, a Norfolk girl from a village called Pullham. She had been in the linen room at the head of the back stair when the first shot came, and she had thought, in the first instant, that a gun had been discharged in the yard. When the second came, she had known, in the way a servant knows the geography of a house better than its master, that it had been indoors, and she had come down the servants' stair with a candle in her hand to find out what was moving in the hall. She met the figure in the cloak at the turn of the passage. She saw the wig. She saw the crepe. She saw, plainly, the mouth beneath it, and would later swear to that mouth in a court at Norwich. There was a fourth report. The ball took her low in the body, and she went back against the wall of the passage, and then down along it to the floor, and lay there, still holding the candle, though the candle by then had also gone out. 4 shots. 4 bodies. It had taken, from the click of the hammer in the porch to the fall of the candle in the servants' passage, no more than perhaps 100 seconds. In that 100 seconds, 2 men were killed, and 2 women were left with wounds that would shape whatever remained of their lives. The figure in the cloak did not linger. It went back out through the porch, into the drive, and along the lane, at a pace no faster than a man walking. The lantern's shutter was closed now. The rain had, if anything, thickened. Somewhere in the west of the house, the child in the nursery slept on, unwoken by the reports, held by whatever it is that holds a small child on a wet night in a great house at the beginning of its worst hour. Behind him the alarm was already spreading. The footman was at the rectory door. A groom, roused from the loft over the stable, ran for the constable's house. Candles were fetched. Water was fetched. Someone, thinking of the child before he thought of anything else, went up the west stair 2 treads at a time. A boy was sent on horseback for the doctor at Wymondham. A boy was sent, on foot, for the magistrate. Within an hour the great porch at Stanfield, that had been a place of an evening's air, was a place of lanterns and voices, and men in wet coats standing in a wide half-circle around what lay on its flags. At Potash farm, 2 miles off, no one at supper had heard a sound. The wind had carried what noise there was in the other direction, and the walls of the great house had, in any event, held most of it in. Mary Wells was in the kitchen putting away the last of the crockery. Emily Sandford was in the parlour with the elder children over a book. The office was hushed, its door still closed, its key still in the lock from the inside, although the man who had turned that key was no longer in the room. Some time before 10 he came back. He came in at the back door of the office, from the yard, in the same way he had gone out. He did not, at first, speak. He drew off the horseman's cloak and hung it on its peg. He drew off the wig and folded it into the crown of a hat and set the hat on the shelf. He unpinned the crepe and put it into a drawer. He took the 2 pistols out of the cloak and set them on the desk. He sat for perhaps a minute in the hard chair with the horsehair cushion and looked at nothing. Then he opened the door into the kitchen and asked Mary Wells in an even voice whether there was any of the broth left from supper. There is one moment more from that night that we must sit with, because it is the seam along which what has just happened begins, without ceremony, to become the story that will follow. Emily Sandford, from the parlour, heard her master's step in the kitchen and came down the short passage to the office door. She saw the cloak on the peg, still wet. She saw the mud on the boots by the fender. She saw a smear on the boots that she would later, in a court at Norwich, say she had not at that moment thought about. She asked him, in the ordinary voice of a young woman speaking to the master of the house at the end of an evening, whether he had been out. He said, in the same ordinary voice, that he had been in the office the whole while, and had not stirred from it. He reminded her of what he had told her some weeks before. She was to say, if any person asked her, that he had been at Potash farm the whole of that evening, and had not left the house. She looked at him for a long second. She did not, so far as anyone could ever prove, agree in words. She turned and went back up the stairs to the parlour and closed the door. 2 miles away, in a porch that had been swept dry that morning and would not be swept dry again for many mornings, the doctor from Wymondham was climbing down from a wet trap into the lantern light. In the servants' passage inside, a young housemaid from Fulham was still breathing. On the flags of the hall, a young wife with a shattered arm was still, by some grace, awake. And beyond them all, in the chapel at the west end of the house, 2 bodies had been laid out under sheets by hands that had been shaking too much to fold the linen straight. The wounded and the dead. The doctor from Wymondham was a man named Nichols, and he had been in bed when the boy on horseback beat on his door. He came down in a coat pulled over his nightshirt, listened for less than a minute to what the boy could tell him, and went out to the stable in his slippers to help harness the trap himself. He was on the road by 9:30. The rain had not slackened. The trap lantern threw a jumping yellow ring onto the wet hedges, and the pony, an old one, laid her ears back at the noise of the wind and went at a trot that Nichols did not press. He reached the porch at Stanfield Hall a little before 11. There were already lanterns there, a great many of them, held by men in dripping hats. A groom took the pony's head. Nichols went in past the flags where Isaac Jermy the recorder lay under a sheet that had been laid over him by the housekeeper, and past the foot of the newel stair where his son lay under a second sheet, and he did not stop at either. It was not the habit of a country doctor to stand over the dead when the living were still bleeding in the next room. I want to keep us with him for a little while, because Nichols is our best witness to what that first night in the great house was like, and because his hands, more than any other pair, decide what the county wakes up to. They had carried Sophia Jermy into a chamber off the hall, a small ground-floor room used by the master for his private letters, with a couch along one wall and a fire that had been lit in a hurry. She was on the couch. Her dress had been cut away from the right shoulder and the arm below it by a maid with a pair of household scissors. The ball had gone into the flesh above the elbow, splintered the bone, and lodged somewhere Nichols could not, at first, find. The blood on the towel folded under her arm was, by his own note the next morning, of a colour that told him she was still, at that hour, holding on. She was awake. She knew him. She had been treated by him twice before, for the ordinary things that happened in a great house, a child's cough, a chill after a long ride. She asked him, in a voice that had almost no breath behind it, whether her husband was dead. Nichols was a man who had learned, over 30 years, that a lie told in that chamber at that hour did not stand up in the morning and only made the second telling worse. He answered her plainly. She closed her eyes for perhaps a second, and then she opened them, and she asked him to save the arm. The record does not tell us what he said to that. It tells us only what he did. He worked on the wound for the better part of an hour, with the housekeeper at his elbow holding a candle in a hand that did not shake, and with a footman standing outside the door to keep the passage clear. He did not, that night, take the arm off. He extracted what he could reach of the ball, packed the wound, bandaged it, and gave her a little of his own laudanum in water. When he came out into the hall, he told the man from the rectory that she would live if the fever did not take her in the next 3 days. He said it, from the sound of the note, without any great confidence. Then he went along the servants' passage, past the linen room, to the turn where Eliza Chastney had fallen. The housemaid from Fulham had been moved by then only as far as a settle in the passage itself. To lift her further had seemed, to the women who had first come to her, more dangerous than to leave her where she lay. She was 23 years old. She had been in service at Stanfield for 4 years. The ball had entered her low in the body, on the left side, and had not, so far as Nichols could tell in the lantern light, come out. She was conscious. She knew the housekeeper's name. She could say, when Nichols asked her, the day of the week. She could not, when he asked her, sit up. He worked on her too, in the passage, with a second lantern brought from the kitchen and set on the flags. What he could do that night was small: clean the wound, pack it, bind her tight enough to slow the bleeding, and give her, as he had given the mistress, a spoonful of laudanum. He would not attempt more until the light. He told the housekeeper, in a voice pitched under Eliza's hearing, that he thought she would live to see the morning. Beyond the morning he would not say. I have to stop the companion voice here for a beat before we go outside. It matters that you hear, before anything else, that both women lived through that night. In the storytelling that grew up around Stanfield in the following weeks, the porch and the two bodies took almost all the room. Sophia Jermy and Eliza Chastney, who had also been struck, and who had also lain on the floor of that house in the same 100 seconds, were often almost forgotten. The record does not let us forget them. Neither will we. Outside, meanwhile, the news had begun to move. In a wet country in 1848, news moved at the pace of a horse and the strength of a man's voice at a farm door. By 10:30, the constable at Wymondham had been roused. By 11, a rider was on the Norwich road with a note in his coat. By midnight, the Reverend George Andrew, who was the vicar of the parish of Wymondham and a magistrate, had reached the porch and taken charge of the scene. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, in a black coat still spotted with the rain, and he did what a magistrate in a great house does at that hour. He set a footman at the door. He set a groom at the drive. He told the housekeeper that no candle was to be moved and no cloth was to be lifted until the morning. He asked of every servant in the hall where each of them had been at the moment of the first shot, and he had a clerk from his own house write the answers down in a memorandum book. He asked also, and this is the question that carries the rest of our story, whether any person about Stanfield had reason to think ill of the family. There was a pause in the hall then, of the sort in which several servants looked at one another and none spoke. The housekeeper, whose name was Mrs. Reed, said at last, in a voice that was steadier than she felt, that the master had for a long time been at odds with the tenant of Potash Farm. She said the name, James Blomfield Rush, plainly, and only once. The Reverend Andrew wrote it in his book, closed the book, and put it away in his coat. At about the same hour, in the low room off the kitchen at Potash Farm, Rush was drinking a mug of the broth he had asked Mary Wells to fetch him. He had taken off his boots. The boots stood by the fender, muddy to the ankle. His coat was on the back of the chair. He answered, when Mary asked him whether he had been out, that he had stepped only as far as the barn to see to a sick calf. She did not, in the moment, believe him. She did not, in the moment, say so. She took the empty mug from him when he was done, and rinsed it in the scullery, and went up to her room over the dairy, and lay in the dark listening to the rain on the tiles. Emily Sandford, the young governess from Kent, went up to the room under the eaves at about the same hour. She did not, according to her own later account, sleep at all that night. She sat on the edge of the iron bed with her hands folded, and she listened to the wind in the apple tree, and she thought over a sentence her master had spoken to her some weeks before, when he had put a folded paper into her hand and told her to keep it safe. She did not open the paper that night. She only thought about it, and about the mud on the boots by the fender, and about the smear along the side of the right boot that she had seen and had said nothing of. It is the smallest of moments in the record. It is one of the moments that would, 4 months later, help to hang him. By first light the wet had eased. A grey sky lay over the flats. In the yard at Stanfield, the grooms were rubbing down the horses of the men who had come in the night. In the porch, the sheets had been laid back onto Isaac Jermy the recorder and Isaac Jermy the younger, and their faces had been washed by a woman from the village, whose usual work at the house was to see to the linen. In the chamber off the hall, Sophia was sleeping the shallow, drifting sleep that follows opium. In the servants' passage, Eliza had also been given more laudanum, and had at last been carried on a shutter to a bed in the housekeeper's room, where the fire could be kept up. In the west nursery, a child of 2 years had woken and asked, in the way of a child, where her mother was, and had been told that her mother was ill and could not come. The news reached Norwich by the first coach of the morning. It reached Wymondham with the milkmen. It reached London by the evening papers of the 29th, which set the story on their front pages in the tall, black type kept for railway accidents and the deaths of members of Parliament. The Times sent a man down on the morning train. The Norwich Mercury sent 2. By the end of the week, the porch at Stanfield had been sketched by 3 different artists, and the drawings would appear in the illustrated weeklies in London within the fortnight, along with likenesses, more or less imagined, of the recorder and his son. I have to say plainly here that no illustrated weekly in London made a picture of Eliza Chastney's bed in the housekeeper's room. None made a picture of Sophia Jermy's arm in its bandage. The papers, then as now, preferred a porch to a sick room. The magistrates worked, meanwhile, with the plainness that Norfolk magistrates were known for. The Reverend Andrew was joined, in the course of the 29th, by a second justice, a Mr. Cann of Wymondham, and together with the constable they walked the drive, they walked the lane toward Potash, and they walked the yard behind the great house. They found footprints along the drive. They found at one point a smear that might have been mud from a particular field. They found, near the porch, a small piece of dark cloth caught on a bramble, of a weave that would later be shown to have come from a horseman's cloak. Every one of these things went into the memorandum book. By the afternoon of the 29th, on the strength of Mrs. Reed's answer in the porch, and of 1 or 2 other things the magistrates had learned in the hall, a warrant had been sworn out for the arrest of James Blomfield Rush of Potash Farm, on suspicion of the murders of Isaac Jermy and Isaac Jermy the younger, and of the shootings of Sophia Jermy and Eliza Chastney. The constable, with 2 others, rode out along the wet lane at about 4 in the afternoon. Rush met them at the door of the kitchen. He was in his shirt-sleeves. He had been, when they came into the yard, going over the ledger at the table. He listened without interrupting to what the constable said. He asked, once, to see the warrant, and read it through with a slow steadiness that impressed the constable enough to be written down that night. He said, when he handed it back, that a great mistake had been made. He said he had been at Potash Farm the whole of the previous evening, and had never left the house, and that any person about the place, his housekeeper, his children, the young lady who taught them, would swear to it. The constable did not argue with him. He simply took him. They put him on a horse. Mary Wells brought his coat from the back of the chair, and his hat from the shelf, and did not, when she handed them to him, meet his eye. Emily Sandford stood at the door of the parlour with the eldest of the children beside her, and watched the 3 horses turn out of the yard onto the lane. She said nothing. The child beside her asked, in a whisper, where her father was going. Emily said, in a voice that was almost steady, that he was going to the town to answer a question and would be home soon. He would never be home. By nightfall on the 29th of November, James Blomfield Rush was in the cells at Wymondham. By the middle of the following week he had been taken to Norwich Castle to await the assizes. By the end of the week, the doctor at Stanfield had begun, cautiously, to hope that both his patients would live. And in a plain room at Potash Farm, in the last drawer of a farmhouse desk that had lately been much used, a bundle of papers wrapped in oilcloth was waiting for a magistrate to find it. Somewhere, in a lodging in Wymondham, a young woman from Kent was being asked, for the first time, and by a stranger with a memorandum book, to sit down and tell what she knew. The testimony of Emily Sandford. I'll write Chapter 8 now, keeping the register calm and inward as the production continues its descent. The lodging in Wymondham where she was taken to answer her first questions stood on a side street off the market square, above a saddler's shop that had already closed for the evening when she was brought up its stairs. There was a room on the first floor kept for exactly this sort of business. A fire in the grate, 2 chairs at the hearth, a table with an inkwell, and a clerk in a wool coat who did not, at any point in the hours that followed, look up from his page. The constable led her in. The Reverend Andrew, the vicar of Wymondham who had taken charge at Stanfield Hall the night the shots were fired, stood at the window with his back to the glass. Mr. Cann, the second justice, sat at the table with his pen already trimmed. She was invited to sit. She sat. I want us to stay in that room with her for a moment before we come to what she said, because the room matters. She was 19 years old. She had been in Norfolk 15 months. She was wearing the woolen dress her mother in Kent had made for her the summer before she left home, and she had a headache of the sort that sits behind the eye and will not lift for water. She had refused, on the stair, the cup of tea the saddler's wife had offered her, because she was afraid that if she took it her hand would tremble against the china and give her away. The record does not tell us whether she was cold. It tells us only that she was very still. Andrew was the one who spoke first. He did not begin, as one might expect, with the night of the 28th. He began instead with the morning she had first walked up the lane to Potash Farm from the Wymondham coach, in the September of the year before. He asked her how she had come to be engaged. He asked her the wages. He asked her what her duties were. He asked her the name of every person in the household, and he asked her, twice, to describe the room off the kitchen that her master called his office. She answered each question as it came. The clerk in the wool coat wrote each answer down. It was, in its way, a piece of craftsmanship on the vicar's part. He was giving her, without her knowing it, a slope of small truths to walk down, so that when they came at last to the harder ground, she would be already in the habit of telling him what she had seen. A country magistrate in 1848 had no science of the interview to lean on. He had only his ear and his patience and the fire in the grate behind him. Andrew had all three. By the second hour they had come to the autumn just past. He asked her about the papers her master worked on at the desk in the office. She said she had seen him write letters and copy pages out of a book, and once she had seen him hold a lit candle very near a sheet of paper for what she had at the time thought was to dry the ink. He asked her, quite mildly, whether she had ever been given a paper of her own to keep. She looked at her hands. She said, after a pause the clerk would afterward remember as being long enough to count to 10, that she had. Here we have to slow down, because the paper she was speaking of is one of the hinges on which the whole of the coming trial will turn. It had been given to her, folded once, on an afternoon toward the end of the summer. She could not, when pressed, name the day. Her master had come out of the office into the passage where she was mending a stocking for one of the children. He had put the paper into her hand. He had told her that if anything should ever happen to him, she was to take it to a lawyer in Norwich, whose name he then gave her, and that she was to say nothing of it to any person in the meantime. She had put the paper into her work-box, under the pincushion, and had not opened it. She had not, she said, thought very much about it in the weeks that had passed. She had only thought about it hard since the night the boots had come in muddy to the fender. Andrew asked her, in the same mild voice, whether she still had it. She said she did. He asked her whether she would send for it. She said she would. A boy was dispatched, with a note in her own hand for Mary Wells, and by the middle of the next morning the work-box was on the table in the lodging above the saddler's shop, and the folded paper was in the vicar's hand. I have to admit that the record does not tell us what Emily Sandford felt when she saw the paper come out of the box in another man's fingers. She had, from that afternoon in the passage, been the only person in the world who knew where it was. That was a lonely piece of knowledge to have carried through the last months of the summer and the whole of the autumn, and it is easy to imagine, although I would rather not invent for her what she did not write down, that watching it pass out of her keeping was in some way a relief. The paper, when opened at the table, was a will. It was in her master's hand. It was witnessed at the foot by two names that neither Andrew nor Can recognised, and that would later be shown to have been written by the same pen as the body of the document. It set out, in the plainest possible terms, that the whole of the tenancy of Potash Farm, together with all moneys owed and all claims still outstanding against the estate of Stanfield Hall, were to pass, in the event of the master's death, into the keeping of Emily Sandford of Kent, for her sole use and benefit. She had not known what the paper said. She had not opened it. She said this, in the lodging above the saddler's shop, more than once, and she said it in a voice that Andrew, in his own note made that evening, described as being without any colour at all. She had believed, she said, that it was a matter of business only. She had believed she was only to carry it as far as a Norwich lawyer's door. She had not, she said again, opened it. Andrew did not press her on the point that afternoon. He had been a country magistrate long enough to know that a witness who has just seen a piece of her own life laid open on a table needs an hour to recover before the next question is put. He rose, closed the paper, and told her that she would be brought back the next day. The clerk closed his book. The saddler's wife brought up at last the cup of tea, and this time she took it. "I want to come back into the room with you for a beat here. If you are half awake at this hour and finding it hard to keep the threads, hold on to this one." Emily Sandford was, from that afternoon onward, not simply a witness in her master's case. She was, on the paper the vicar had just folded shut, the person who would inherit everything if he were hanged. That was the position the magistrates now needed her to speak from. It is one of the hardest positions a young person has ever been asked to speak from in an English courtroom, and how she carried it, over the days that followed in Wymondham, and over the longer days that were coming at Norwich, is what shapes what happens next. She was questioned again on the following morning, and again on the day after that. The questions moved by careful stages from the paper to the evening of the 28th. She told them about the supper. She told them about the master leaving the table before 7, and going into the office and turning the key in the lock from the inside. She told them about the parlour and the Bible stories and the elder of the children reading a verse aloud in a voice that had not, in the years since, left her memory. She told them about coming down at a little before 10, when she heard her master's step in the kitchen, and about the cloak wet on the peg and the boots muddy at the fender. She told them about the smear on the side of the right boot. She told them she had not, in the moment, thought about it. She told them that in the days afterward she had thought about it a great deal. She told them what her master had said to her in the passage, that he had been at Potash farm the whole of the evening and had never left the house, and that she was to say so to any person who asked. She told them she had not agreed in words. She told them she had turned and gone back up the stairs to the parlour, and that she had closed the door behind her, and that she had sat down with the child on her lap, and had not been able for some time to go on reading. The Reverend Andrew asked her, at one point in the third afternoon, whether she was afraid of her master. She thought about the question for what the clerk again described as a long time. She said at last that she was not afraid of him now. She said that she had, on 1 or 2 occasions in the autumn, been afraid of him. She would not say more about those occasions, and Andrew did not press her. By the end of that week, her deposition had been taken down in full, read back to her twice by the clerk, and signed by her at the foot of every page. It ran to 11 pages of the memorandum book, in a hand the clerk had kept as even as he could. It named the paper. It named the boots. It named the passage. It named, without any adornment, the sentence her master had spoken to her in the doorway of the office. It would, in the assize court at Norwich, be the single most important piece of testimony the prosecution would put before the jury. Word of what she had said began to reach the outside within the week. The Norwich papers had, by the middle of December, given her a name in their columns, the young governess at Potash farm, and had begun, in the way of newspapers, to draw her portrait more from imagination than from any sitting she had ever given. In one paper she was small and dark. In another she was tall and fair. In a third she was said to have wept through the whole of her deposition, which she had not. The illustrated weeklies in London picked up the story with the new year, and by the time the assizes opened in the March that followed, a young woman who had, until 15 months before, been quietly teaching French and the letters of the alphabet in a house in Kent, had become one of the most talked-of women in England. She did not, so far as any of her surviving letters show, read those papers. She was kept, from the middle of December onward, in a lodging in Norwich at the expense of the Crown, under the care of a woman who had been a nurse at the Bethel Hospital, and who would not let a newspaper into the room. She wrote, once, to her mother in Kent. The letter has not survived. She wrote, once, to a cousin in London, and that letter has, and it says only that she was well, that she was being treated kindly, that she prayed each night for the young mistress at Stanfield Hall and for the housemaid Eliza, who was still, at the end of that winter, learning to walk again, and that she did not know what would be asked of her in the spring. At Potash Farm, meanwhile, the searches that had begun on the day of the arrest were going on. In the last drawer of the master's desk, wrapped in an oilcloth that had once held a piece of harness, the magistrates found the bundle of papers the young governess had never seen, the forged deeds, the letters in unknown hands, the drafts and second drafts of a story about the Jermys of Stanfield Hall that had never been true. They took the bundle into evidence. They took the wig from the box room. They took the horseman's cloak from its peg, still faintly stained down one side. They took the 2 pistols from the desk. And in his cell at Norwich Castle, the master of Potash Farm, for he had been moved by the 2nd week of December from Wymondham to the county gaol, spent the shortening winter days reading and writing and preparing, in the manner of a man who intended to defend himself, the long address he meant to give from the dock. He had refused counsel. He had been told, more than once, by more than one attorney sent to reason with him, that this was folly. He had said each time, in the level voice the constable had noticed on the first afternoon in the yard, that no living man knew his case as he knew it, and that no living man would speak for him in that court but himself. By the beginning of March, the days in Norwich were lengthening. The rooks were building again in the trees along the castle mound. The gaolers had begun, for the first time in months, to leave the window in the cell open for an hour in the afternoon, and the master of Potash Farm sat under it with a small stack of paper on his knee and worked at the pages of his defence. In her lodging on the other side of the city, in a chair by a fire she had not laid, the young governess from Kent sat with her hands folded and waited to be told the day on which she would be called. The day was not, in the end, long in coming. The Norfolk Spring Assizes opened on the 29th of March, 1849, in a court that would, within the week, be so full that the sheriff would have to order the doors closed against the crowd still pressing to get in. The trial at Norwich. The court at Norwich Castle on the morning of the 29th of March, 1849, had been swept out at first light by 2 women in aprons, who had done that work every assize for as long as anyone could remember. They laid a fresh matting along the floor of the well. They opened the 2 tall windows behind the bench, and the March air came in with the sound of the rooks from the mound outside, and with the smell of the river beyond the castle wall. By 9 o'clock the doors had been unbolted, and by 9:30 the public gallery was already filling from the stair. The sheriff's officers had orders to admit no one without a ticket, and the tickets, printed on card the week before, had been sold and resold in the coffee-houses of the city for sums that would have kept a labourer's family for a month. Let us stand for a moment at the back of the court before the judge comes in. The bench, with its worn oak canopy and the small brass rail along its front, faces down the length of a room that is not, as a stranger might expect, very large. Norwich Castle held its assizes in a chamber that a modern reader would find close and airless, panelled to shoulder height in a wood that had gone almost black under 2 centuries of candle smoke. The jury sat to one side in a raised box of 12 seats. The dock stood opposite them, and at that hour on the 29th of March the dock was empty, but the 2 officers whose task it would be to bring the prisoner up from the cells were already at its door. I need to keep the companion voice a moment longer, because the whole of what follows sits on a decision the prisoner had already made and would not be talked out of. James Blomfield Rush had refused, more than once, the offer of counsel. He would defend himself. He would question every witness the Crown put up against him, and he would speak, from the dock, for as long as the judge would let him. The attorneys sent to reason with him in the weeks before had come away shaking their heads. His own family had written to him, and had not been answered. He had spent the winter drawing up a set of notes for the hearing that ran, by the count of the man who had brought him paper, to something over 300 pages. He had them, when he was brought up that morning, in a canvas bag looped over his wrist. The judge was Robert Monsey Rolfe, a baron of the Exchequer, a Norfolk man himself, in his early 50s, known on the circuit for the flat calm of his temper. He came in a little after 10. The court rose. The clerk read the indictment. The prisoner was asked, in the ordinary form, how he pleaded. He answered, in a voice that carried without effort to the back wall, that he was not guilty. Sergeant Byles opened the case for the Crown. He was a compact man in his silk gown, a barrister who had built his practice on the circuits and knew this bench well. He spoke for the better part of 2 hours. He set out, in the level manner of a man who is not going to raise his voice for effect, the history of the feud between the Jermys of Stanfield Hall and the tenant at Potash farm. He set out the mortgage. He set out the falling due of the mortgage on the last day of November. He set out the evening of the 28th, and the porch, and the servants' passage, and the 4 persons who had been struck. He named the wig. He named the horseman's cloak. He named the 2 pistols. He named the bundle of papers in oilcloth that had been found in the last drawer of the office desk at Potash farm. And he named, as his principal witness on the facts within the household, Emily Sandford of Kent. The prisoner listened to all of it without moving. He made, in the whole of that opening, only one note. The first witnesses on the 29th were the ordinary ones. The vicar, Andrew, gave his account of the porch. Mr. Cann, the second justice, gave his of the yard. Dr. Nichols of Wymondham was called next, and told the court, in a voice so flat that the juryman leaned forward, how he had worked over Sophia Jermy on the couch in the little chamber off the hall, and how he had worked over Eliza Chastney on the settle in the servants' passage, and how, at 3 o'clock on the following morning, he had come out into the yard and had leaned against the wall of the stable and been sick. The record does not tell us why he added that last piece. It only tells us that he did. Sophia Jermy did not appear in person. Her arm had been taken off in the January, and she had been very ill after it, and the court accepted a deposition sworn in her bedroom at the Hall. It was read aloud by the clerk. It named the figure at the foot of the stair. It named the wig. It did not name the man behind the wig, and it did not pretend to. She had only, in the passage, seen a shape. Eliza Chastney did appear. This is one of the moments I have to hold you at, because it is one of the moments the papers in London wrote about most, and it deserves better than the sketch they made of it. She was carried into court on a chair by 2 officers, and set down at the foot of the witness box. She could not stand for long. She was 23. She had been in the housekeeper's room at Stanfield since November, and had, by the March, learned again to take a few steps between a chair and a window, but the length of the well of the court was beyond her. She was sworn where she sat. She spoke without looking at the dock. She told the court where she had been on the servants' stair when the ball struck her, and what she had heard from below in the seconds before, and what she had heard from above in the seconds after. She could not name the man in the passage. She had only, she said, seen the shape of a wig against the lantern that had been left burning in the alcove. The prisoner in the dock rose when she had finished, and asked her, in a voice that was not unkind, whether she had ever, before that November, seen him about the great house. She said she had not. He asked her whether she had, on the evening of the 28th, seen a face at all under the wig. She said she had not. He sat down. Some of those in the gallery were surprised he had let her go so easily. Others, in the notes they made that evening, thought he had done the only thing he could. To press her would have been to be seen to bully her, and even in that court, in that year, that would have finished him. The second day of the assizes was given, almost in whole, to the witnesses from Potash farm. Mary Wells, the housekeeper, was called. She told the court about the supper on the 28th, about the master leaving the table before 7, about the office door turning on its key, about the boots muddy at the fender, about the broth she had brought him, and about the mug she had rinsed in the scullery. She was cross-examined by the prisoner for 3 hours. He worried at every hour of the evening she had spoken of, and had her name each hour twice, and asked her whether she was sure of the striking of the church clock at Wymondham. She was sure. She was, in the way of a woman who had run a farmhouse kitchen for 11 years, extremely sure. He tried again with the elder of his own children, who was called next, and who was 13, and who had been fetched into court on the arm of a great-aunt from Norwich. The child gave her evidence in a voice pitched so low that the judge asked, twice and with real kindness, whether she would like a chair drawn nearer. She did not remember, she said, that her father had left the house that evening. She did not remember that he had come in muddy. She had been in the parlour with the younger children and their governess, and she had been read to. She looked once at the dock. She looked again at her hands. She was allowed to step down. Emily Sandford was called on the afternoon of the third day. I want to stop the witnessed past for a beat here, because if you have drifted a little in the last hour, this is the moment to come back into the room with me. The whole of the trial, and, in the end, the whole of the case, will turn on the 90 minutes she is now about to spend in the witness box. Everything else is scaffolding around her. She came in from the side door. She wore, for the occasion, a mourning dress that had been given to her by the woman who had had charge of her all winter, a black woolen dress with a high collar, no jewellery, no ornament in her hair. She was 19 years old. She was very pale. The papers in the following days would describe her hair as fair and her eyes as grey and her voice as barely audible. The gaolers in the yard afterwards said that her voice had, in fact, carried the whole length of the well without any effort at all, and that the only reason it seemed low in the reporters' accounts was that the court had been so silent while she spoke. She was sworn. She gave her name. She gave her age. She gave, without adornment, the history of her engagement at Potash Farm, and the names of the children and the room under the eaves. Sergeant Byles led her through, as he had led her through in Wymondham, the paper she had been given in the passage. She said again that she had not opened it. She said again that she had believed it a matter of business only. She said what her master had told her to do with it, and to whom, and by what name. Byles brought her, then, to the evening of the 28th. She told them the supper, and the office door, and the parlour, and the coming down before 10, and the cloak wet on the peg, and the boots muddy at the fender, and the smear on the side of the right boot. She told them what her master had said to her in the doorway. She spoke of it, this time, in a court of some 400 people, with the same evenness she had used in the lodging above the saddler's shop the winter before. The prisoner rose, when Byles had finished, to cross-examine her. I will not, this late in the night, take you through the whole of what he asked her, because it went on for the better part of a day and a half, and because it did him, in the end, no good. He tried, again and again, to make her contradict herself on a detail of the passage. He tried to make her uncertain about the hour of the striking of the clock, and about the exact wetness of the cloak, and about whether the boots had, in truth, been muddy that night, or only, perhaps, damp. He suggested, more than once, that she had misheard the sentence in the doorway. He suggested, at one point, that she had never received the paper at all. She answered each of these things in a voice that did not rise and did not fall. She looked at him. She did not look away from him. The Reverend Andrew, who was in the court every day and made a note each evening, wrote that she was, in her whole bearing during those 2 days, the calmest person in the room. By the end of the 4th day, the Crown had closed its case. On the morning of the 5th day, the prisoner opened his defence, and here we come to the part of the trial that the papers in London had been waiting for. He began at 9. He spoke, with 2 short breaks for water, until nearly 6 in the evening. He spoke again the whole of the following morning. He read from his notes. He put in evidence a great sheaf of the papers found in his desk, insisting each was genuine and had been misread by the magistrates. He named men in Norwich and in London who, he said, would swear to his character, and read out letters they had written him in the past. He returned, over and over, to Emily Sandford, and to what he called the impossibility that a young governess in his own house should have been permitted to remember and to swear to matters she could not truly have known. He spoke, by the reckoning of the shorthand writer, for something like 14 hours across the 2 days. He did not once, in the whole of it, offer the court an account of where he had been at the moment the shots were fired. Baron Rolfe summed up on the evening of the 6th day. He was brief. He set out the evidence in the order in which it had been given. He warned the jury, in careful terms, that the deposition of Sophia Jermy, and the testimony of Eliza Chastney did not, on their own, name the prisoner. He put to them, plainly, that the case turned on the evidence of Emily Sandford, on the papers found in the desk at Potash, and on the wig and cloak and pistols. He reminded them that the prisoner had chosen to defend himself, and that they were not to hold that against him. He said very little else. At a little after 7 in the evening, the jury retired. They came back in 10 minutes. The foreman gave the verdict in a voice that was not quite steady. The clerk asked whether the verdict was the verdict of them all. The foreman said it was. The prisoner in the dock did not move. Baron Rolfe put on the black cap. He passed the sentence in words that had not, in that court, changed for 100 years. Somewhere in the gallery a woman began to cry, and was helped out. In the yard behind the castle the rooks were coming in to roost for the night, and the sky over the mound had begun to lower toward the long spring dusk. James Blomfield Rush was taken down to the cells at 7:30. He was to be hanged in the yard outside the castle on the morning of the 21st of April. The scaffold and the silence. The night we have followed for so many hours is nearly done, and I would like, before we come out into the yard at Norwich Castle on the morning of the 21st of April, to sit for one more moment in the cell where the prisoner was kept in the 3 weeks between the sentence and the drop. If you have been with me since the porch at Stanfield Hall, you have earned the right to that pause. If you have only just come in, keep hold of these few names as we walk. James Blomfield Rush, the master of Potash Farm. Isaac Jermy of Stanfield Hall, and his son Isaac Jermy Jr., both fallen in the passages the November before. Sophia, the young wife, alive but with her right arm gone at the shoulder. Eliza Chastney, the housemaid from Fulham, learning again to walk. Emily Sandford, of Kent, 19 years old, the governess whose evidence had closed the case. Hold those names loosely as you drift. They are the people this chapter has to lay to rest. The cell was on the north side of the castle, a room of stone about 10 feet by 12, whitewashed at the beginning of every assize and again after every hanging. A window a foot square, high up, let a rectangle of light travel across the floor between 8 in the morning and 2:30 in the afternoon. There was an iron bedstead against the far wall, a table under the window, a chair, a Bible, and a stool for the turnkey who sat inside the door in the last week. The prisoner had asked for pen and ink and had been granted them. He had asked for a candle in the evenings and had been granted that too. He was allowed no razor. He was shaved every 3rd day by a barber from the city who came in under the eye of the governor and did not speak. He wrote a great deal in those 3 weeks. He wrote to his children, and those letters have been kept. He wrote to a cousin in Norfolk who did not answer. He wrote a long paper for the governor of the gaol, setting out once again, in the level hand the court had seen, the reasons he still held for saying he was innocent of the death of Isaac Jermy and of Isaac Jermy Jr. The paper was read by the governor, folded, and placed in the file with the other papers of the case, where it would sit for many years. He wrote, twice, to Emily Sandford in her lodging on the far side of the city. Both letters were opened, read by the chaplain, and returned to him unposted. She never learned that they had been written. The Reverend Charles Wade, chaplain of the county gaol, came in to him at 6:30 each evening. Wade was a man of 39 who had taken this duty for 11 years, and had walked more than 40 men to the drop in that time. He was known in the city for the mildness of his voice, and for the fact that he would not, under any pressure, tell a reporter what a condemned prisoner had said to him in the cell. He spoke to Rush of the ordinary things at first, the weather over the mound, the news from the town, the psalms for the evening, and only afterwards, in the 2nd week, of what was coming. Record does not tell us what passed between them in those hours. It tells us only that the chaplain came out from the cell each evening looking tired, and that the turnkey, who had been asked to sit inside the door, said the 2 men prayed together at the end of every visit. We have to leave the cell, for a moment, and go out across the city on the morning of the 20th of April, because by then Norwich was no longer the county town it had been through Lent. It had become, in the way English cities became on the eve of a great execution, a fair. Travellers had been coming in for 3 days, on foot from the villages, in carts from the market towns, by the London coach from further off. Every inn on the market square was full. Every lodging house within a half-mile of the castle had let out its parlour floor. Farmers had come up from the flats around Stanfield Hall and had brought their sons. Newspaper men had come down from London and had taken rooms in the Maid's Head and the Bell. A man was said to have travelled from Edinburgh by rail and coach to see the drop. A woman was said to have brought her infant on her back from a village near Fakenham. The city constables had been doubled since the Monday and stood in pairs at every corner of the streets that led toward the mound. By the evening of the 20th, the space around the castle had begun to fill. The gallows was to be set up on the flat roof of the gatehouse on the bridge, above the arch, so that the drop would fall in view of the whole of the ground below. The carpenters had been at work through the afternoon. The beam was in place by 4. The trap was tested by the executioner himself at a little after 5. His name was William Calcraft. He had come down from London 3 days before, and had lodged, as he always did on his circuits, in a plain room at a coach inn on the edge of the city, and had spoken to no one about his business. He was 50 years old that spring. He had held the office of common hangman since 1829. He was known to Rush by name, as he was known to every prisoner in every condemned cell in England, and Rush, when told on the Sunday that Calcraft had arrived, had only nodded. The night of the 20th was, by every account we have, uncommonly still. There had been rain in the earlier part of the week, and the mud in the streets had begun to dry along the edges. The moon was a little past the full. The sky over the mound was clear enough that a man in the gallery of the White Horse could see, if he leaned out, the outline of the beam above the gatehouse. Somewhere on the far side of the city, in a lodging above a saddler's. No, the saddler's had been in Wymondham. We should get that right. This was a different lodging in Norwich altogether. A young woman from Kent sat by a fire she had not laid, and did not eat the supper the nurse had brought her. She had been told, that morning, what was to happen in the yard the next day. She had asked to be moved further into the city so that she would not hear the crowd from her window. That had not been possible. She had, in the end, asked only for the shutters to be closed, and had sat, from that evening onward, in a room lit by a single lamp. The morning of the 21st of April 1849 came in cool and clear. A light wind moved across the mound from the north. The chaplain came to the cell at 6:30 and read the office for the day, and then the office for the condemned, and then sat with the prisoner while a breakfast was brought that was not eaten. Rush was dressed in the clothes he had worn to the trial. He was given a black cravat to put on over the collar of his shirt. He was given, when he asked for it, a glass of brandy and water, which he drank in 3 swallows without setting the glass down. He said to the chaplain only that he was ready. The crowd in the ground outside had begun to gather from 3 in the morning. By 6 it had filled every yard of open space within sight of the gatehouse. By 7 it stretched back along the streets that led down toward the market. By 8, when the bell of St. Peter Mancroft began to toll, it was reckoned, by the men who had climbed onto the roofs to look, at somewhere between 12,000 and 30,000 people. Nobody has ever agreed on the number. One of the London papers said 40,000, and another said 12. The truth is nearer the lower figure than the higher one, but it does not in the end very much matter. It was the largest crowd Norwich had seen in living memory. It was the largest crowd that would ever gather in that city for that purpose. Public hanging in England had less than 20 years still to run. The procession came out from the door in the south wall of the keep at a little before 8. The under-sheriff walked at the head in his gown of office. The governor of the gaol walked behind him. The chaplain walked at the prisoner's right shoulder, reading in a level voice from the burial service, as the custom then was, over a man who was still alive but was accounted, in law, already dead. 2 turnkeys walked at the prisoner's left. Calcraft walked behind, with the rope in his hand. The prisoner's arms had been pinioned at the elbows. He walked steadily. He did not, so far as any of the men on the walk itself afterwards said, look at the crowd or at the beam or at the flat of the trap. He looked, as he crossed the bridge, at the stones under his feet. At the door on the gatehouse he was asked, in the ordinary form, whether he wished to make any last statement. He said he did not. He said only, and the men close enough to hear him wrote it down as best they could afterwards, that he hoped his death might, by the mercy of God, be received. Calcraft drew the white cap over his head. The rope was placed. A hush ran through the ground below that was afterwards remembered, by more than one person who had been there, as the loudest thing in the whole morning. The trap fell at 8:07. I want to hold you at the edge of what happened next, because a listener has a right, on a night like this, not to be made to stand in a place they do not want to stand. The drop given him by the science of that year was short. His neck did not break at once. He struggled for a matter of about a minute, and then he was still. The crowd, which had held its breath as the trap went, let out a sound between a groan and a sigh that men who were there afterwards said they had never heard in any other gathering, and hoped they would never hear again. Some in the ground turned their faces away. Some lifted their children onto their shoulders to see. The chaplain went on with the office in the voice he had used at the door. Calcraft, when it was over, went down the stair inside the gatehouse and out of the yard and back to his lodging, and left Norwich the following morning by the London coach. The body was cut down after the usual hour, taken into the Gale yard, and buried, without a coffin, within the walls, in the plot set aside for the bodies of the executed. There was no stone. There was, as the custom was then, only a mark cut into the wall of the yard opposite the plot, and a page in the Gale book with the date and the initials. The crowd in the ground outside took some hours to disperse. Ballads were sung in the streets by mid-afternoon, and were being sold, printed on a single sheet, before the day was out. A wax figure of the prisoner, in the clothes he had worn to the trial, was on show at Madame Tussauds in London within the month, and would stand in the Chamber of Horrors there for the better part of 100 years. At Stanfield Hall the news came in on the afternoon coach. The house was in mourning still. Sophia Jermy heard it in her upstairs chamber, and, so far as her sister-in-law's letter of that evening records, said only, "May God forgive him." I do not know that I can. She lived on at the Hall for many years, and outlived in the end most of those who had walked with her that night. The estate passed at her death to a cousin. The porch was repaired. The bloodstains on the flags were scrubbed with sand and lye, and then, when that did not answer, laid over with new stones the following spring. The stones are there still. Eliza Chastney of Pulham learned in time to walk without a stick, though she limped for the rest of her life. She left service at Stanfield within the year, and took a position in a smaller household on the coast. She married a fisherman in 1852 and had 4 children. She lived until 1891. She spoke of that night, according to her daughter, once, in her old age, and would not speak of it again. Emily Sandford went home to Kent in the summer of 1849, on a coach paid for by a subscription raised quietly by a small group of Norwich gentlemen who felt that a young woman who had done what she had done in that court should not be left to make her own way back. She did not, so far as we can trace her, ever come to Norfolk again. She married, some years later, a man whose name has been given differently in different tellings, and I would rather not name him wrongly. She had children. She lived out an ordinary life. The paper she had once been given in the passage at Potash farm, and which had, by the evidence she had given in a court in Norwich, undone the man who wrote it, was placed in the case file at the assizes and is there yet. Potash farm stood on for another century as a working farm. Stanfield Hall stands still. The rooks come in, on autumn evenings, to the trees along the moat. Somewhere in the parish register at Wymondham, the marriage of James Blomfield Rush is entered in a hand that has faded almost to nothing. Somewhere in a churchyard in Kent, in a plot no one now visits, a governess lies under a stone that gives no hint of what she once did in a court a long way from home. And somewhere in the file at Norwich, the folded will lies still, in the same crease, in the same ink. The candle at your bedside has burned low. The wind over the mound has settled. The rooks have gone to their roost. And history, in the quiet way it has, turns the page in the dark.